So, yeah, as I mentioned, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first episode of the Defence Series for 2021. For you, those of you that don't know, the Defence Series is, well, currently only a virtual event, but we hope to do something in person, COVID dependent, later on in the year. These events are aimed at discussing and tackling the most up-to-date technology challenges within UK government and defence. To do some brief introductions, my name's Danny, and I'm going to be your host. My day-to-day job, I work for Iowa Associates, which are a high-scale technology recruitment company. I run the defence division at Iowa Associates, where we specialise in placing cutting-edge technology professionals across data, AI, project and program management, DevOps, electronic warfare, cyber, synthetics, and simulation. You should be able to see a QR code on the front of the screen. So if you'd like to discuss anything related to resource planning or project delivery or anything there, you can scan that code and it will take you straight through to my LinkedIn. Feel free to send me a message on there and we can set up a call after that. We have 5 panelists with us today. I will allow them to introduce themselves, going through and talk a little bit about what they do, what their businesses do, and how they're involved within the data space. So I guess to start off with, Nabil, would you like to introduce yourself to everyone?
Morning, Danny. Thanks for having me, and good morning to everyone. Yeah, I'm CEO of Invisio, which is a spatial data science company. So we're currently a team of about 75 with data and geospatial data experts working in the defence and public sector. So we use our software, third-party software, open source, to find insights between data and location, given that 80% of data has a location element. So often these customers don't know the insights exist and they can exploit it to improve their operations, reduce risk or reduce cost.
Amazing. Thanks, Nabil. And Daniel Clark from Adaga, would you like to introduce yourself, sir?
Morning, Danny. Thank you very much for the introduction. So my name's Daniel Clark. I'm the Head of Applied Sciences at Adaga. And Adaga is really set up to take in lots and lots of disparate sources of unstructured data, so typically text, to extract the sort of knowledge and the relationships between that text, and then establish sort of a methodology for reordering this and placing a lens over the data so that you can extract insights that are relevant to the sort of customer application. And at the moment, we have quite a strong focus on defence because there's a lot of interest in how, particularly with the integrated review, integrated operating concept, how defence can better leverage its data and better leverage technology advances in companies like Adaga to gain better insight from all of the data that they have available. So really looking forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. And Alex, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Alex Burton. I'm from the London office of Rebellion Defence. Rebellion Defence has a C and an S. We're a US-UK company that was launched in July 2019. And we are solely a defence company, and the founders set it up with an understanding that defence on both sides of the Atlantic needed to exploit more of the AI talent from the Shoreditch area, from Seattle, and from the West Coast. So set up a VC-backed company, doing complementary things to some of the other people on the panel here, really, which is making sense of vast amounts of data and delivering insight to the commander at the speed of relevance. So acknowledging that we've got to both be able to process at the edge and at the enterprise level. And we deliver some of those analyzed products. We also have a cyber wrapper that offers vulnerability analysis, red teaming, and automated pen testing within that ecosystem.
Amazing, thanks, Alex. And Darminder, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me on today's panel. Yes, Darminder here. So I head up the AI and data science space within Fujitsu Defence and Security. So Fujitsu is quite a wide and multi-sectored business. So within defence and security, predominantly our business is fundamentally around service integration, system integration, and deploying services for defence. So currently we look after a lot of the defence's infrastructure around networks and servers. So fundamentally our business is around cybersecurity and networks. And so part of the data science and AI initiative within Fujitsu is to leverage on that data, and also fundamentally, as everybody else has said, look to leverage the the vast amounts of data which is now within defence, and as part of Defence's vision moving forward, looking to extract as much value from that data. So yeah, should be interesting to find out what everybody else has to say. Thank you.
Amazing, thanks for that. And finally, Rob, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Morning, everyone. Morning, Danny. Thanks for inviting me to the panel. So, Rob Clifford, I'm head of data for BAE Systems Maritime and Land, which is a relatively long title. I'll unpick that very slightly. So, Maritime and Land is part of BAE's core offering, and it's made up of naval ships, submarines, land, and maritime services. So, 4 component businesses, and I sit there sort of across the top, if I can say that, looking at data as a strategic asset. In terms of our presence in the UK, domestic defence market, I think everyone's probably aware of BAE, so I won't give you chapter and verse on what we do. My role, really, and I've joined the business in this role only recently, is to take that data we have and start to exploit it and unlock the insight from it, and recognizing that's a journey BAE won't be making just by itself. It needs to work with partners across defence and with the mod to really get the best out of this equity. I think, like a lot of people on this call today, will all have similar sort of approaches and backgrounds. The real challenge here is to turn good intentions into sort of practical outputs that we can turn around and say, look what we achieved, and this is the benefit of digital and data methodologies in doing that. So very excited to be here, Danny. Thanks.
Amazing, thanks, Rob. And for everyone who's watching this live, I mean, generally most of our views will come post-show from the recording, which will be shared on our social channels. But for anyone who's here at the moment, you can see all of our QR codes. All of our panelists are part of fantastic businesses, and if you're interested in finding out a little bit more, you can be able to find their LinkedIn, and I'm sure they're looking for fantastic people within the space. So without further ado, let's get into it. We've got a fair bit to cover, so this may even end up being a 2-part show. But if we start off with the first question we've got, and I'll ask this openly to the panel, is how do we improve the availability and accessibility of our data across defence? Broad question.
Shall I kick off then?
Yes.
Okay, go for it.
I felt the need to fill in the silence there. If you had a one-word answer, it would be open standards. I think the digital backbone is great, bringing together infrastructure, but you're going to need open standards on top of that to enable the access. So if you've got, it's the case that 25% of MOD systems have data that is discoverable, and 33% don't follow international standards. And that's not my stats, that is straight out of the Defence Data Management Strategy of last year. So we've still got silos of data and silos of networks that are all proprietary. Now, interoperability isn't saying, here's a proprietary system, put everything in my proprietary system, I'll make sure it'll talk to another proprietary system, I tell you. It's actually got to be open standards, so you can get rid of vendor lock-in, you can share that data, you can discover that data, and then therefore that can be used for multiple applications across the defence sector.
I'd jump in there, Danny, and build absolutely on what Nabil said. So in terms of that mechanism for providing the accessibility, standards have to be a key part of that. But if I was being slightly provocative, I would take one step back and say, what data? Now, in my experience as both a civil servant and in the private sector, we simply don't have a handle on yet the art of the possible, what is actually out there. And now we have this, in mind, a sort of paradigm where we'll understand eventually all of the data that is potentially exploitable, and that will, 1 + 1 will equal 2. Well, until we really understand what we actually have, we won't know anything about the quality of that information and the potential insights that can be drawn from it. So being rich in data is great. And there's something we probably will come on to in this conversation around sustainability. And, it is Earth Day today. But data, it's not about just generating more and more and more data. It's about the insights we drive out of that data through the application of tools and process. So, I'll leave some for the other commentators to jump in on. But for me, absolutely standards is going to be the key, as Nabil said, in terms of how we access that, but really understanding what is in that ecosystem and the potential value of it or the lack of value is going to be critical to this as well.
Yeah, and just to add to what Matt said there, it's the actual engineering that has to go around the data itself. We talk about data as an infrastructure. We want to utilize data as an asset. All of that implies that a lot of planning, maintaining, and resourcing needs to happen around it. So that's an infrastructure cost initially, but eventually, once the hard work and the hard graft has gone into making it a reliable data infrastructure, and I kind of utilize analogy. We nowadays take utilities as something we for granted, right? We always get our gas supply, electricity, and it's because of all the hard engineering that's gone around it, anticipating that demand and the cycles around utilizing that data, and essentially from that allowing data then to be used as a reliable source of information, and that essentially then builds the trust within that data, to create the ecosystems for you to allow you to work on that data around different initiatives and problems. So I think the engineering side of things, and we've looked about open standards, of course, that's one element to it, and sort of the integration patterns between different data sets and data sources also is an integral part of that as well.
Danny, maybe I can jump in with I guess almost a reflective question into how do we make sure that we have the availability of the right data? So as sort of the scientists, we typically use machine learning to solve problems where it's really difficult to write down an elegant sort of analytical sort of formula to describe the problem we're trying to solve. So we take lots and lots of data and we try to learn the statistical relationships in that data, and then to derive a sort of solution based on those statistical relationships. Now, if we're looking at something in defence, and there's a whole load of different applications, making the right data available and potentially the right data that has been effectively labelled or tagged is probably the more important part of that. How do we make data available? Because simply making all of the cat videos that are available on YouTube available to defence isn't gonna help it. In fact, it's probably going to make it more difficult for them to develop effective and elegant solutions. So I appreciate I've given you almost a question back, but I think it's about making the right data available at the right place. And I really liked Alex's comment about Rebellion, about being able to do the processing at the edge, but also in the cloud at the same time. How do you make the data available at the edge and the cloud and all of the places in between?
Thanks. That's a kind segue into me, Daniel. Thank you. I like Dharminder's sort of metaphor of we've got an integrated utility sector at the moment. How do we get that? It was all down to engineering. But if I can sort of stretch the metaphor a little further, I think the challenge we've got now with data is that we've got gas, we've got electricity, we've got water, we've probably got sewage all going down the same pipe. And it's a lot more difficult to reverse engineer that such that you get it down to a level. And I think my worry is that when we look at it, and others have pointed to it, when we look at it, we try and solve the whole thing at once. Defence, in fact, government is really good at describing a vision and an end state. I think they're less good at trying to break down what's achievable over the next 18 months and how do you transition from legacy systems to that vision, which is necessary. And by legacy systems, I don't mean things that are 10 years old. I mean things that have very excitingly been created by sort of insurgents in the single services. All of that is good. The challenge now is to try and get those stovepiped insurgencies at single service level such that they can talk to each other and you get the shared right data. And I suppose one sort of closing comment as perhaps one of the most contemporary practitioners at the other side is that it's got to be done. There is no choice, because when we look at our core adversaries, there's that fusion between the military and the civil, where that data is shared, and that data is shared and collectively processed, because you've got a one force between military industry, civil industry, and the military as a whole.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I think something that does come up a lot these days is there's so much data, even just in the normal world, everything is recorded these days, and getting the right data seems to be one of those key questions. If we make a slight assumption and assume we've got the right data, how do we best improve the quality and accuracy of that data, do you think?
So I just want to build on what Alex has been saying as well, and sort of come into your point there as well, Danny. I think it's absolutely right. I mean, we always look at the big problem and we're trying to solve it. It's about breaking it down into manageable chunks. Looking where data already exists and how it's being used. So fundamentally, what I mean by that is, you take one part of your business, you identify how the data is traveling between different users. So data itself is boundaryless. It's going to be used by multiple stakeholders, multiple people. So if you have an ability to map, different people and how they're utilizing that data, that kind of creates a mini ecosystem. It's about then how you define the roles around that data. So specifically who's using the data, the people that are going to create the services and the tools to extract the value from that data. Essentially how that data or the insights that are generated are going to be communicated across to other people. And I think that's a good place to start, because by starting small you can start to scale out and build that capability moving forward. And I think from the learnings of how you start off small, you can then start to understand limitations in both data quality, fundamentally access, because that's always the biggest problem when you start off any data project. But fundamentally the quality, and to sort of to Daniel's point initially, when we start to look at applying the data value elements, so the machine learning, the predictive side of things around data, fundamentally how much of the data do we need? We look at data features, we look at fundamentally a set of features that give the most probable accuracy to a particular predictive outcome, and that informs the labeling side of things as well. And fundamentally we can't really say all data is good, and I think everybody's addressed that point to some degree. It's fundamentally how you can support the machine learning or the AI that sits on top of that data to kind of handhold it and develop the proven insights that fundamentally make the most impact. So it's a combination of that learning and that cycle and the iterative development process, essentially.
I completely agree, Danny and Darminder. I think I'd just jump in with one observation around the quality piece and that accessibility bit. And it's stating the bleeding obvious up front. But digital and data, we can't and we shouldn't separate those out from standard business strategy. They are an enabler for delivering your business strategy, not something that stands alone. And why do I say that? Because if anyone who's been involved in a data quality exercise will very quickly, if they trace the root cause back, realize that it's something about the fundamental business process that generates that data that causes the downstream quality issues. So let's be clear, if we are talking about improving the quality and availability of our data, at some point we're going to have to start looking at the underlying business practice or activities or capability development that generates that data. Therefore, I'm absolutely bought into I think it was the sort of Mayo Clinic approach that Darminder mentioned, of start small, think big, move fast. Pick an area, get to the root cause, understand it, and use that as the sort of tip of the spear or the exemplar to start improving the next part of the process. And again, any conversation around data quality wouldn't be finished or concluded until you said, what is good enough? We need a sense of good enough in the business. And I agree, it might have been Alex who said it. We don't need to improve all of the data across the estate to the gold standard. There are certain load-bearing pieces of information or insight that we absolutely will need to improve. other bits, we need that sense of what is good enough. And I think being able to develop that through actual practical exercises is going to be critical to accelerating to the pace we need to be at to compete with our potential adversaries. Over.
It's interesting, Rob. I mean, I think we'll probably spend most of our time on this discussion agreeing with each other, because we all know what we're trying to do. But then I sort of sometimes sit and reflect, and I know, you see the sort of, defence digital team, and it's only been going 18 months, and there's some great work that's been that's ongoing, and the Defence Command Post Integrated Review, all the right noises. So why in practice do we not see this moving when everybody who's in this sector is all saying the same thing? Is it a culture blocker? Is it a management stop? What's stopping this? Because we are all, I'm certain, all going to be agreeing.
I think, I'll take one bite of that and then fairly hand over to others. Having spent some time working with Defence Digital over the last couple of years, I actually think I'm positive, I'm optimistic that things are starting to change and move forwards. And I just highlight an excellent blog recently, Defence Digital blog. And apologies to the teams whose names I forgot. Their first ability, or first piece of work to get cloud accepted, public cloud, as a potential way to surface information. It's a fascinating read, and they're quite explicit in that blog, saying we're not trying to boil the ocean while we do this. We're trying to prove to people that if you go about this in a transparent, measured way, attacking a specific problem, we can see progress. If we'd had this session maybe 18 months ago, Bill, I would be very much glass half empty, but I am cautiously optimistic that is changing. But I'll stop there and hand over to colleagues.
Yeah, I think Rob, I think that's a really fair assessment. I also think there's a sort of there's a human character element to it as well, which is that quite rightly, the last 3 years, the sort of major advances have come from what I would describe as sort of the insurgents on the front line. Those individuals sort of felt the pain most, seen the opportunities most clearly. And have done some fabulous transformation. Defence Digital, and I agree with you, Rob. I thought that was one of the best blogs in terms of a strategic shift within the department. Defence Digital has had to sort of sit in the background, doing the unloved regulation, not being as well connected with the front line and with that cause and positive effect. And I think that what the next 2 years will need to do is have Defence Digital offering an incentive to the frontline commands and a bit of fear of missing out, with the frontline command drawing in, so that you get that sharing of data and sharing of benefits. And I sort of looking at some of the chat from the other contributors, and Steve Burton made a question about, are we talking about data to change our business practices, or are we talking about changing the battle space sides of things? And I think it's a good question, but it kind of has to be both, because I'm not sure. You can silo some of the applications and some of the models, but I'm not sure you can silo the data that feeds those models. And so my view is that unless you look at both of them together and incentivize everyone from DNS through to the frontline commands, through to the intelligence agencies, to offer their data up into Defence Digital, who has custody of it, then I'm not sure we'll see the really transformative opportunities. But I agree with Rob that Defence Digital is making strides here, and they now need to sort of mobilise the energies that you've got down on the front line.
I think maybe, Alex, if I can add to that as well, I think one of the challenges, and this goes back to your question, Nabil, is one of the reasons why it perhaps doesn't move as fast as we in industry would like to see it move, is because actually it's really, really difficult. And Defence has a sort of a set of objectives that it's trying to achieve, and it meets those objectives relatively well, right? Or almost go as far as to say extremely well. So how do you pivot from doing sort of one way to doing a new way while maintaining excellence in what you did before? And so the whole data piece, the whole what are we using data for, what are the applications, it's really, really challenging. And I think one of the other sort of aspects of the defence picture is that defence is relatively poor. If you look at how much money defence has in comparison to, say, the research budget of Google or Amazon or Microsoft or any of the big tech companies, defence is incredibly poor, right? So Amazon can afford to test out methodologies, it can afford to test out new ways of doing things without massively affecting its sort of, revenue generating operations. Defence has to maintain its capability and pivot at the same time. And I think that's one of the things that makes it really, really challenging.
It's such interesting points, and I think the thing that I was personally most keen to hear the panel's viewpoints on, and it's often my, I guess, favorite challenge, and we've touched on it briefly there, is when it comes to the future of data, or advancing down the path we want to advance down, how much do you guys think it's going to be based on new technologies, AI, machine learning, pick your poison, compared to knowledge, education, and behaviors of the people to drive it forward, do you think?
So if I just come in there, I mean, just to start off the discussion, I fundamentally think it's going to be a mix of both, but it's, any transformation effort, technology can only get you some way. I mean, you look to technology as being the enabler. It's fundamentally going to be people and cultural. You need the right skill sets. You need to have, I think one of the questions as part of this panel was about data literacy. Fundamentally people that understand how to use data, work with data, work with it, understand, communicate, is fundamentally also a very important aspect to working with data. And everything has to be, the foundations has to be data. So, we come back to the question about infrastructure and utilizing it as an asset. That's fundamentally going to be people looking after that as an asset. You need people who understand how to measure the quality, how to make sure that data is constantly being looked at from the value of delivering outcomes, and I don't want to bring business terminology, but KPIs, essentially key performance indicators. So I think it's a mix of both. I mean, technology itself, as technology moves on, that's going to evolve the data skill landscape as that evolves. So it's as I say, it's going to be very much a marry between the two, and yeah, that's I think I'll leave it there for the time being.
If we're following a rough, order, I'm happy to jump in here. I think the panelists were all going to say broadly the same thing, Danny or Daniel. It's, technology, absolutely, and process. I think I'd add another piece to that, collaboration, and collaboration not just with, the mod, but actually amongst partners here on this call. We all have parts of that puzzle. Now, BAE, has a vast amount of data, has a lot of capability it develops. I'm not sure. Am I audible? Sorry, I can see Danny talking as well. Yeah, great stuff. So capability, we developed that. We developed the data that goes with it. Mod needs to exploit that. But we absolutely need to recognize that we all are part of the solution for the Ministry of Defence. We need to bring different insights and different culture and different process to that. I completely agree with the point that the technology will take us so far, but you need the culture that says this is important, we value this, but that extends, right back from left to right. That goes into, education, training, what skills subjects people are taking, whether we have a STEM first approach in our society. We can't solve all of this problem ourselves, but we all need to have a common posture when it comes to this. Let's assume though, 2030, we get to the point where we've got a system, an education system that promotes STEM. We know where our data is. It's then really over to the technology and the technologist to let loose in developing that capability. And that's definitely what's happening in other parts of the world. But I'll pause there.
Rob, maybe I can sort of almost expand on that. And I'm going to quote somebody else, which I don't know if this is good in the panel. And it was Bob Work at one of our AI symposia that we held in September last year. And he said that it's something that really stuck with me, and it was that artificial intelligence, so let's say data science, is an accelerant for all other technologies, right? And the side that has the most elegant and effective solution will gain an asymmetric advantage over their adversary. And I think this is exactly it, is that the technology is only one of the small pieces in enabling that elegant and effective solution, as you rightly said, the education, the training, the data literacy, the understanding what we're trying to solve with the technology in the first place will allow us to build that elegant and effective solution. And it's not just about the data, it's not just about the sort of the algorithms, it's the whole almost pan-DLOD package, right?
Danny, let me sort of jump in. I mean, I think I'm going to say a couple of slightly provocative points. Firstly, you described it as new technology. I mean, the reality is it's not new technology to everyone outside Western defence. My understanding is that no financial transaction below £1 billion is done in anything other than digitally. So the rest of commerce, and if you look back at the last 20 years, the biggest shock up until COVID that this world had was the financial crisis in 2008. And all of those individuals after that decided that probably the safest way to do this was to continue to do it digitally. And yet defense continues to have that internal debate about whether this is right. So I think my first context would be, we're not talking about groundbreaking technology here. We are talking about, and we touched on this right at the very beginning, really, really complex data, really confused and in some instances dirty data sets. And I think here's where I'm going to come on to Al Searle's point about it's an enterprise approach. It needs the ecosystem with defense companies as well. And the answer is yes, and I think I go back to my point of, this is all about a competition. It's all about a competition against countries, in particular China, but also Russia, countries that are investing hugely in this sort of capability and have got a few civil military approach. So my position would be, it's not just sharing between companies, industry and defense. I can see a situation, if we are to deter and win in a competition against China, where the data on an American, I'll use the naval vernacular, which is my world, the data that is held within an American sonar is uploaded onto the cloud, is shared with a British sonar, and the algorithms are updated and trained based on data that is shared across industries and across navies, which will be the only way that we can maintain that AI edge against an adversary that is doing that all the time.
But Alex, I think it is a competition amongst industry. I mean, I think the point made about proprietary systems, let's be all open and honest here, in the defense sector, everybody has moved to information and information advantage. If you're a company selling hardware or sensors, you're now talking information and data. If you were something that spent 20 years doing ETL, you've moved straight into the data warehouse space. So everybody is saying, here's data, use my systems, use my algorithms, let's be where the money is. So I think, what the customer base needs to do in defense, they're going to have to police it. And I think that is where Defence Digital has a role to say, okay, guys, you've all shifted. You used to sell laptops. You're now, you're now into data and AI. Here are the rules, and this is how we are going to operate. How do you fit into this if you want that play? So I think I can understand, certainly from a customer perspective, and also the soldiers and sailors on the ground, how do we get technology to them? The other thing I would add, probably on the culture bit, and I suppose it goes back to talking about, I think it was Rob's point about MOD not having a huge amount of money. It's also the culture bit on disruption. And I would say accountable disruption. Because how many disruptors are there within the military environment? How do we nurture how does the MOD nurture those disruptors and still have them in a promotion system? And then on top of that, how do we have accountability? So people who have the creativity for disruption, yet are accountable for a clear ROI. Because if we do compare with the private sector, where we see CIOs come in and here's a massive multi-million-pound data lake project, out goes the CIO 18 months later because they haven't made the ROI. So there's a lot of great projects going on. And I think whereas Darminder talked about KPIs, the ROI needs to be clear. So if people like us in industry want to play in the space, we've got to also step up to say, do you know what? I need this capability to the warfighter. Here's the ROI. Agile often gets used as a bit of an excuse. Actually, this is what I need. This is how much it's going to cost. You either deliver or you don't. And I think Defence Digital needs to put the rules of engagement around that in the data space.
Yeah. Just to add to what Nabil said, I think part of that also has to involve the risk side of things. How much risk is Defence Digital willing to take? And from that perspective also, if for something which is quite risky, let's say for defence, because it involves quite a upfront investment, if in order to support that sort of division moving forward, looking outside to other companies that, let's say, start off, look at startups, for example, they don't have the initial resourcing and manpower behind them, but they look to offer or leverage the collective, the outside community, the crowdsourcing side of things, to enable some of their hard decisions and inform them about next steps. Could some of that thinking be brought into defence? You look at collective intelligence as a way of improving, forecasting and ability to ask right questions and get the right information. So your ability to sort of break down very, very complex things can start from looking at it from a bigger crowdsourcing collective perspective. Collective in this instance to defence, that might be within defence, but there's an opportunity here for defence to go out to the open source community as well, or the outside community in general. And to Nabil's point, yes, then that defines the rules of engagement and how they operate that mechanism. But essentially, it's fundamentally lots of things to contributing to the overall aim, and I think that's also important to bring into play.
I'd just add, from a final point from me, I think there are some grown-up conversations to have here between ourselves and with defence colleagues. Something that comes up so often for me is requirement setting, if I can call it that. What is it you're actually trying to achieve? And if we can, have that dance, get round it, be really clear, we can slightly go beyond in terms of our approach and our direction, the letter of the law when it comes to a tender. We want to achieve X, Y, Z in terms of our KPIs. Be really clear what your direction here is. If it is that you want data to be shared with yourselves, defence, and with partners, because we all have a part to play in it, be clear about that. The grown-up conversation is, there is a commercial aspect to this, but at the same time, we all want to do what's best for UK PLC. We want this endeavour to succeed, and I don't think there's any organisation here that would put, their own corporate interests in front of that. But the reality is, there is a structure. We need to understand what we're going to deliver and that there's going to be a market for it, which means we need the defence community to be really clear what it is they want to achieve so we can plan and sort of de-risk, I suppose, the delivery of capabilities. Over.
Yeah, I'm just going to very briefly sort of touch on what Rob said, because we sort of danced around the subject. I mean, this is a fascinating group of discussions which is focused on the technology, but we're sort of all dancing around the fact that actually most of the challenges associated with this are not technological, and one of the ones that people are dancing around here is the commercial element of it. If the new value that defence has, that it needs to win in a competition, is a coherent data that spans defence industry and international allies. For instance, how does the intellectual property rights and how does the value come from that? And I think that is a conversation which is happening, but is probably not happening quick enough and is slowing the ability for industry
for allies and for defence to move some of the algorithms and the models which are at the heart of this forward as quickly as they could do.
Just to add to what Alex has just said as well, around the commercial agreements, you know, when defence procures things, it's been very poor on addressing the data element within those contracts. You know, you fundamentally ask your customer, can I have access to data X? Oh, unfortunately, we don't have access to it because it's not in the contractor agreements with the vendor. So I think those hurdles need to be overcome as well, and I think that comes back down to data literacy within mod as well. How do we put data to the top of those agendas in the contracts negotiations, and making sure that data is fundamentally part of that process rather than the end hardware or the end application.
I can completely agree with Dominda. You know, sometimes there will be data that people are not going to share. Fine, it may be IP, it may be something else, but being clear what those small elements, the 5% that you can't share, that's one thing. We should be moving to a presumption, and if we have to do it through contractual negotiations, that the rest of it is up for grabs, in a sense, that it's there to be exploited as a common resource. Now, instead, we get into this sort of dialectic position where we heave from one side to the other. You can have it all, you can't have any of it. We just need a nuanced approach here. And I am confident people like Caroline Bellamy absolutely leading the charge in Defence Digital. We will get there. But I think all of this, you know, let's just de-risk the commercial side of it, get the approach right, and then push forward with a common endeavour. Easy to say, but I do think strides have been made by, you know, people on this wider group as well of attendees today. Over.
Rob, maybe I can come full circle with something Alex said right at the start of this little part of the discussion, is that this isn't necessarily something new, right? I mean, this has been happening outside of defence for a very long time. And I kind of go back to my PhD, and I spent most of my PhD generating data and writing algorithms in a way that's maybe not reflected in what happens in defence. And I think almost the summary point that I'm getting is that maybe there's more necessity for defence to reach into organisations that are like, you know, Fujitsu and Rebellion and Adaga, that are doing this as part of their day-to-day work, right? You know, if we don't do this, then we won't succeed as companies. And so maybe defence can be better. And I wouldn't want to say, sort of accuse them of not being good, but maybe defence needs to reach into organisations and pull in their processes and their methodologies and their way of doing things. Because, as Alex said, you know, we've been doing this for a long time outside of defence. So let's bring that into defence. I don't know if that's a fair summary, Alex, or not.
No, I think it is. It's quite easy, isn't it, to have a pop at defence from the outside, and I'm not doing that. I mean, I think that, you know, defence has a huge amount of data that we as industry and academia need to help defence. There's a really interesting question to be had as to how much of the IPR of a model is owned by the department if they give data to our exceptional data scientists and coders to create an algorithm. All of those things, because we know the institution, a good number of us have at various stages served within the institution, because we know the institution is naturally cautious with process and legislation and protocols, those risk hindering the development of really competent and battle-winning algorithms, because the coders will do it, you know. So my worry is that some really quite Gordian issues need to be unravelled across Whitehall, and probably need to be unravelled amongst our closest allies if we're really to get battle-winning AI models. And I'm not sure that's happening at the pace that it should do, because the coders will get there and they'll deliver if they've got those.
Well, I'd love to see DSTL play a greater role here, because, I mean, historically, they've done some amazing work, you know, going back a number of years, that, you know, the SIE work has been ongoing in DSTL and various guises for a long time. And there's some, there's some great research that is ongoing. Daminda was talking about, the risk element there. Those are pure play research projects. So I think, certainly, we're talking to some of the, at brigade level, they see the, the work that's going on with DASA and upcoming with Battle Labs, but actually having more of that engagement between pulling through those DSTL projects into the wider army. So there is a plan of how to pull that research through. I think there's a lot of stuff already there, ongoing in research that is generating IP already within the MOD.
Nabil, maybe I can ask a question there, because that's really interesting from the research perspective. And having previously worked at Siemens designing autonomous cars, we lent a lot on open source data sets. And the one that sticks in my mind was one that was designed by Berkeley. And it has something like 120 million, I don't know if it was 120 million images or if it was 120 million video segments. But kind of I'm almost guessing that such a data set doesn't exist for defense applications, because autonomous driving is one of the largest societal challenges of the early 21st century. You look at Waymo, and they're claimed to have driven, I think, around 20 million miles in their cars, which is a huge amount of training data. And I guess the question is, how do we effectively do the research unless we have access to those data sets? Because the autonomous driving data sets aren't necessarily going to translate well into battlefield resupply robots, for instance.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's one of the elements of tying all of this in together, where you've got a piece of research that proves a capability to a certain TRL level. But then how do you take that in terms of, proving that it can scale and taking up the TRL, which opens up the same conversation we had about how do you get access to that data, both open source or MOD data, which probably also then ties up with the ROI, because actually, if there is value to say, we've proved this capability at a certain level, now let's prove it with those data sets, but that costs money. But actually, this is what we're trying to deliver. But actually, somebody needs to own it and pull it together. And I would say, DSTL is a great place to pull that together. Where, and I love then you've also got, the battalions that are just going to be doing, test and research. I think there is an opportunity here to really to use this part of the organisation all the way through into the wider green and grey military. But yeah, I accept it's a problem.
Just to pick up what the conversation between Daniel and Nabil, and this is also around data and data generation and data access and open source data. So to Daniel's claim, Waymo 20 million miles worth of driving. How much of that claim is effectively actual driving compared to maybe synthetic environment type driving? So, data in terms of how it can be used in the synthetic environment to kind of address risks, how it might work in the real world. It could fundamentally help with the de-risking and also help with the element of cost involved with actual experimentation, and also trying to ratify whether some sort of research works in the real world environment. But no, I'm not actual real life experimentation. I'm not discrediting, that has to be done. That's fundamentally the end outcome. But to get some part way there, how much of that can be done within synthetic environments as well?
In my experience, defence is an exceptional environment, but it can learn from other parts of government. Nothing achieves change like ministerial pressure. If you look at other parts of the civil society, you have the Digital Economy Act. Francis Maude pushed that through with some great vigor. You have data trusts. You have this very concept of where data can be shared for the public good. It can be shared with a third party and becomes an asset and a resource that can be exploited. And in many ways, that example being described there, that training data at scale, we should be adopting a similar approach for defense, and it may benefit us. The case by case basis of it, will mean some things change. But if we know there are large data sets that can be exploited out there, but we're worried about how they are governed, having a third party, a trusted third party, curate that so they can be utilized to improve all of our capabilities is no bad thing. And that has worked for other parts of civil society. And I'm sure in the wider defense community, that thinking is already happening. Over.
And I'm going to offer a slight corollary, because I think we're still on the sort of data quality and accuracy. And it's sort of riffing off some of the conversation about sort of autonomous cars. We are in many areas very different from the rest of society with our data, because you can, when you sign on to a website, you have to click a whole host of fire hydrants and street lights, and that feeds a data model. I've yet to have to click onto a narrow beam sonar frequency or a an image of an F-35 or whatever. So one of the challenges, going to your point of data accuracy and quality, one of your challenges is, yes, we've got lots of data. No, we don't know what quality all of that data is, or even, as some of the panelists have said, the value of that data. But I think one of the things we should be clear on is there's going to be a vast gap, even if we did understand all that data. We're not going to have the volume and the breadth of data that we need to properly train some of our models, and that is going to require work with allies so that we pool data, because our adversaries don't have they're fearful of allies, but the reality is they've got one source which helps them. And also development of synthetic data where that data, the richness of that data is not there, because the biggest risk otherwise is that our algorithms are trained inaccurately, for want of a better word. So I think there is another point to the quality and accuracy of data, which is actually we may not have the breadth and depth of data, even if we fully understand our current data. We may not have the breadth and depth of data to properly train algorithms to the quality that our society expects, because our society, quite rightly, has very different bar over which our models will need to get above that of our adversaries.
Just to add to what Alex is saying, that conversation is fundamentally going to be fueled around, as we look to address AI ethics and responsible AI. As that conversation develops, is this ethical? Is this data fair? How much of the bias within the algorithm is reflected within the data? Absolutely, to your point, it's going to be very much a collaborative effort. And I think if you look at the mood music coming out of the JAC, so Joint Artificial Data Center of the US DoD, they're fundamentally wanting to set up, an institution between allies to address this particular problem. And I think from addressing it from the ethical side, I think that will also look to leverage much of what the conversation has been today about data access, data sharing, and collaborative working with data as well.
Alex, Daminda, can I you really touched on something that's really important, something I find really interesting. I'm going to go back to that 20 million miles of sort of experience for Waymo, right? If you actually look at the statistics and you look that there's one accident caused for every 300,000 miles, you see that in that 20 million miles, the number of accident causing events is relatively small, right? So it's 70. And you can almost imagine that each one of those 70 events is absolutely unique. So there is no training data for those unique examples. And one of the favorite examples I give during some of my lectures at the Cranfield University at the Defence Academy is I have a picture of a man in a panda costume stood in the middle of a road. And the question I ask is, what does an autonomous car see? Right? Because we look at it and we see there's a guy in a panda costume stood in the middle of the road. But unless a machine learning algorithm has been exposed to that example, it will never be able to learn about it. And similarly, it goes to your example of the tight beam sonar, Alex, is that unless the algorithm's been exposed to an example of that in the past, there's very little that a machine learning algorithm can do with this new piece of data that it's never seen before. The guy in a panda costume in the middle of a road.
And just to add to what Daniel said, and just want to maybe broaden the perspective of what we've already discussed. I mean, if you add the adversarial element to that as well, your adversary is constantly trying to alter your data, and manipulate it, and confuse your algorithms to certain degrees. That's another different dimension to data quality, data sharing and access. And I think again it comes down to collaboration. If you can legitimately verify that your data you're using is correct before actually going through the training process, because any data which is discredited, you have to go back to the beginning again. Back to your example, Daniel. Yeah.
Where do you guys think? I'll take it back. Daniel and I were speaking a few weeks ago, and he was telling me about I think there was a firm who managed to hack someone's car effectively, and I think I read the other day. I think it was the Israelis are looking to not allow certain models of cars onto their military bases. I think it was the Israelis, just because they are. Yeah, well, I think the term was the perfect spy vehicle. Where we can get into them. So when it comes to like innovation moving forward, all the things we spoke about, how do we ensure like the security of the data? How do we ensure rogue states can't get in? Because that seems to be, certainly from the people I've spoken to, one of their main fears is, or cost is a thing, of course it is, but a lot of people are just worried that got all this data, especially with it being in the cloud, and it because that becoming more of an accepted practice within defense. How much of a part does that play, and how do we keep on top of the security element of that, I think?
Jump straight in there at the start, Daniel. I mean, this is one of the key questions, and again, it's technology and culture. We simply can't remove all risk from every environment. You have to understand, the benefits of going forward with this activity. And I think, you threw cloud in there at the end, and my sort of eyebrow shot at me. It's one of the most secure places you can keep your data, to be clear. In BAE, we are a very large prime. We hold a lot of data. Our approach is, we have a multi-tiered approach to this. So in our subs business, and this is all public domain, I did check, we have a above secret cloud. We have that and barrier Inverness, and that controls that data. But that is not the solution we have scaled across the entire estate, because then we would have a very secure cloud, which isn't required for most of our data. Looking at other cloud solutions will require us to do a few things. It's not just look at the technology, but it's to take a look at ourselves and say, where do we think there is risk in this process? Where is there not risk? And what is the delta between the two of them? There's all sorts of ways to improve the quality and control of data in the cloud, from encrypting it before you put it in there, to the physical side of it as well. Having actual robust governance and internal policy on what we think the classification of our assets are. Now, in my career in a range of different places, I've seen we tend to, and this is the collective we, default to the system classifications rather than data classification. Right, this system is classified to this level, all data that shunts around on it is of that level, and that's not true. What we need is a much more fine-grained understanding of the individual data assets themselves, the context in which they're used, and a sense of the risk exposure. So again, I'm very optimistic about a lot of these things. I think cloud is absolutely a part of the puzzle, but you need to have a clear sense of what the end looks like when you're going in, what you think the risks are, what the benefits are, and then critically, how you articulate that to the rest of the business who don't have an understanding of this, who just see cloud, well, isn't that open access? Question mark. I'll pause there and allow colleagues to jump in.
There's some silence, so I'm going to jump in. I'm going to say it's really difficult, right? Because you've got loads of examples of open source data that has been what we call in machine learning poisoned, right? So somebody's put a fake label on the data and they put it in there. I think one of the examples, and I use this in a lecture on bias in artificial intelligence, is the ImageNet database. There are loads and loads of examples where people have sort of poisoned that data set, which could have a follow-on effect. There's loads of examples, I think, Daminda, you talked about adversarial examples. So if you have a model, you have the data, you can kind of predict how you can cause an incorrect classification through a machine learning algorithm. So there's real challenges with having open source. Of course, if you're open source, you typically get more, right? So you have more data. This Berkeley data set, 120 million images, ImageNet, huge amount of training data. So I guess I don't have an answer other than it's really difficult, and there needs to be a risk versus capability trade-off. because if you have a smaller data set that is stored in a secure area, it's maybe it offers a less elegant and effective solution than a larger data set that is more open. But then there's the potential of this larger data set being poisoned. And then when you add the ethics and the risk of using such algorithms onto, the picture, which military commander is going to sign off a weapon strike based on data that's potentially been poisoned by our adversaries? It's a huge, challenging question for which I'm not convinced there is an effective answer.
I got a couple of points. First to Rob's point, and I think Graham Gillies has put it in the chat as well. I mean, I think the fundamental point on protection of data is sort of reflective of the fact that our current security classification system was sort of designed around the pen and quill, and all of our information now is digital, and it's just fundamentally not fit for purpose. So that needs to change, and the quicker it can change, the more you can provide the level of security that sort of everyone within this audience would want, because it needs to be graded exactly as Rob said. I think the point on pollution of data or manipulation of data, or or us not having enough data. We got to get back to the sort of the fundamental point, which is this is a competition, and it's a competition against our adversary. And what we need to be able to do is to make more effective decisions than our adversary. And by effective, that might mean faster. It might mean less casualties of those that we don't want to kill, and it will mean killing the right person more quickly than they're able to kill us. And there are two comparators. One is our adversary, and one is using the current means of delivering violence, which is not using AI. And the one thing I can guarantee you is that continuing to go down the current process of using spreadsheets and screenshots of PowerPoint, and not enough sailors, soldiers, and airmen typing things into screens will mean we're on the losing side. So there will be mistakes, and I think the core sort of point of conclusion is that however we develop and whatever we develop, we've got to ensure we've got explainability and explicability, so that we can return to our general population and say, yes, there was a mistake here. Yes, we got it wrong, but we've got it wrong less frequently than we would have done otherwise. And by the way, we're winning in the competition against our adversary, despite us having a stronger North Star in ethics than our adversary does.
That's very similar to the smart weapons argument, isn't it? Because military commanders are comfortable making decisions based on the information that was available to them at that time. However, if there was, it goes back to the availability and accessibility of data. If there was data or information that was available, but they just didn't have access to it, that's a separate question, which is very similar to the arguments around smart weapons and collateral damage in terms of ethics of whether you use smart weapons if it's available to you. So I think it will change things in terms of the ethics of warfare, in terms of if that information is available to a commander, then the argument is they should have done. And that's very similar to, you take a commercial, very few organizations look at the value of missing data or poor data. So in their operations, when they've got a business operation and they make decisions on missing or poor data, they are able, and that's where traditionally the ROI on data has been very difficult, to say, actually, we've improved the quality of your decisions by improving the quality of your data or adding new data to give you insights. I think we've got to then therefore move away from the, hang on a sec, we made the best decision with available data, to actually say, did you have all relevant data of the right quality to make that decision? So it's going to be a tricky area, that's for sure.
And that comes back to the question of, asking the right questions of your data, essentially, to facilitate a decision. So just to add to that point, but just a general point around the data security. So I fundamentally see the data security question is fundamentally how you go about collecting the data. So we always look towards cloud first type model. We want all the data in the cloud in one place for it to be used and extracted and fundamentally and extract and value created. You've got to look at the applications as well. I mean, if you're looking at a system which is on the edge, take a UAV drone, having to rely on the cloud to fundamentally ask for data about a specific decision, you've got the latency question as well. How quickly or how infrequently can I have my the data that I require to make the decision available? So I kind of, and it comes down to this question about, I think somebody mentioned multi-tier, but I kind of looked at it as being more hybrid in the sense of being more making decisions where decisions can be made in a more federated way compared to more of a centralized way, because different ways of operating with the data will address different security considerations that need to be be part of how the data is going to be used. And fundamentally, we look to autonomous systems, we look to trust in autonomous systems, we look to, as we give more autonomy to the edge, essentially, can the autonomy start to look after itself where it is compromised from a security aspect, and to notify the human in the loop to say, look, I've been compromised here, don't rely on me. So that's part of the intelligence question as well, and how you can implement that sort of level of trust and integrity in that system itself.
I think I'd just throw in by way of my final thoughts on this one. We can't use risk of
data within defense.
Sorry, we can't use concern or risk as a reason not to change, as an excuse. And when I think about this question, I'm reminded there's a junior civil servant that works in the Home Office and used to work on FOI, Freedom of Information, and there's a very vocal, very democratically minded populace of people who hate speed cameras or hated speed cameras and wanted to see an end to them. And they believed that somewhere in the instruction manual, the documentation for speed cameras, there was going to be a smoking gun that says this thing isn't really accurate. And when it says I'm speeding, it's not empirically correct. Fine. This was pursued for some time, and again, this is all public domain, and eventually working its way up to an information tribunal, which is essentially, it's a proper tribunal of a judge who rules whether you should disclose information or not. And our counsel for the Home Office at the time, very, very, very learned gentleman, argued the case quite passionately, saying, look, the stuff in this booklet, this will allow someone, if they have access it, to damage this speed camera and its operation. The judge, however, ruled against us, and he said in the summing up that he's absolutely persuaded by the arguments that if this was disclosed, someone could damage the speed camera. But he said he was minded to release the documentation because anyone with a brick could damage the speed camera as well. And he was quite right. And we spent a fair bit of money on that. The end result that we're so concerned about may happen anyway. And while that's happening, we're concerning ourselves with some of the niceties and the issues here. Now, I'm not advocating we open everything up and put it on the park bench, but at the same time, we can't leave our fear that something might come to light in the future to stop us being inventive and dynamic in this space. Now, it's a kind of a thereabout example, but I think it's some of the sentiments behind it are broadly the same. We may still lose whilst we're considering the ethics and the concerns and the niceties of this. We need to get it right, but we need to actually push on as well, recognizing a risk for what it is, but doing as much as we can to mitigate it. Over.
Rob, can I sort of jump in with my final thought on that? Because I think you're absolutely right. And I think some of the points raised by Alex and Daminda and Nabil as well have kind of highlighted that solution, right? So Alex said explainability and explicability. And I would add an ability to measure uncertainty in the algorithms to those two topics. And Nabil, you made the point that it was about the commander understanding what that uncertainty and that explainability and that explicability meant so that he could make an effective decision. And I think that's, at least from my perspective as a scientist, that's the key. That's going to be the key in the next step of enabling us to move forward is having that technology to do the explainability, the explicability, and the uncertainty measurements. And I guess maybe it also comes into education as well, to give the commander that sort of knowledge of, you know, with the precision guided weapons, there's a circular error probable that's well understood because it's, you know, it's X number of meters. Actually, how do we give X number of meters for a sort of a machine learning classification algorithm?
I'll jump in that case. I think we're getting sort of close towards the end, and maybe this will end up being a bit of a two-part discussion. I do want to give some of the questions in the chat box a chance to be aired. So I think there's some interesting ones in there. One of the questions I thought was interesting was from Phil Richardson. We have covered this briefly, but Phil was saying, agree with Daniel, defence is welcome to embrace and collaborate with global tech companies to de-risk their investments and exploit their IP and R&D departments. But to what extent is there a cultural and resource limitation on how much mod can do this?
I wouldn't want to talk to the resourcing question, but on the cultural question, I recognise some of the names, Danny, on the call here today. There is a nascent community of digital natives within wider defence, and they're not just in the tech commands. There are people joining these organisations now whose civilian and academic experiences are far ahead of what they see day to day with the services. And I do think you will start to see that change if they're empowered. And, you know, we recognize military domain is a hierarchical organization, but if the message from the top is, do you know what, if you've got some of the SQEP here, please start bringing your ideas to the table and we're going to facilitate, you know, you helping make a change, then absolutely go for it. Some of the governance inside these organizations has changed as well, you know, from the DISC and the functional governance group downwards, say 4-star, 3-star boards to the TLB's own sort of digital data boards. There is a change in attitude that let's try and push the envelope a bit more. And, you know, things like the Percy Hobart Award in itself are encouraging people and backing them to say, let's see what ideas you can have when we provide you with the backing and support there. So I won't talk to the resourcing question, I'll leave that to colleagues, but I think in terms of the cultural bit, if I've answered the question correctly, again, I'm positive I am starting to see changes, and the IR and the political messaging behind that has really said to people, get on with it.
Rob, I'll take that segue, because we've had a Percy Hobart Fellow on 2 occasions now, and we've got someone with us at the moment. And I agree with you. I think there are 2 parts to the cultural question. I think, and I mentioned it previously, there is no doubt that on the frontline commands, from the top to the bottom, and I think that for the first time during this defence review, there has been an absolute coherence at the top of defence across Whitehall of what needs to change and the embracing of technology. Now, you know, I'm old and bold enough to have seen quite a few defence reviews. That is unheard of, and that will be time sensitive and needs to be exploited. And you get it right down at the lowest level. We've got young able seamen, we've got young Marines on the Percy Hobart Fellowship. So I absolutely agree with you that there is a cultural shift both within the top of the institution and at a groundswell beneath. I've got one slight beef though with the cultural part, and that is there is an expectation that I agree. Sorry, let me frame it slightly differently. I think it was Dharminder that said there needs to be a digital literacy. And I absolutely agree with that. Where I have some concern is that is sort of expanded or translated into bringing AI development and model development in-house, either through contractors or through uniformed and civil service AI development. If I can sort of take the first one first, the second one first, that's rather like saying what we'll do is we'll retrain a sailor to build a nuclear submarine. You know, it's almost an insult to the engineers that are you know, at the cutting edge of their skill sets. You know, you just can't train a sailor to be the same skill set as some of the coders that each one of us have within our team. But I think that will be that developing literacy, absolutely. On the bringing contractors in to develop in-house, I've got a concern, which is that these models, this AI will only beat our adversary if it remains evergreen, and will only beat our adversary if the people that are doing the development have the sort of same cohesive team spirit as a company in the army, a squadron in the air force, or a ship at sea. And my worry about bringing contractors in to do the development in-house is that you lose the evergreen element that is ubiquitous with us in our civilian life through applications, and you lose that team spiritedness that you get from a company. So that's my concern about the culture. And like Rob, I can't comment on the resource.
Alex, can I your question? I'll be a really quick one, because I think you raised a really interesting point there. If you look at somebody like a chief data scientist or a chief data officer in industry, they're typically somebody who might have a PhD. They'll have 10 plus years of hands-on experience, and they've gone from being a coder through to being sort of a principal software developer, a principal software engineer, through to being a leader, and they've developed those skills. And I'd almost ask is how can the military have somebody who has a PhD and 10 years of technical hands-on experience? How can that person exist in the armed forces? And I think that's the thing with the culture, is that there is no career profile to enable that. And I think that's one of the challenges. And that might be the contractors, as you say, Alex, or it could be bringing in people at, you know, the lieutenant colonel level or even colonel level who have done that role in industry. And apologies, I jumped over somewhere. I don't know if that was Nabil or Rob. I didn't see who was talking. So I'll pass over. Thank you.
Well, yeah, sorry. I think going back to Phil Richardson's question on global tech, and I also want to offer an alternative to Alex, and I'll offer the alternative first. Is I completely agree with Alex. There are situations where it's development in-house is tricky, but I want to bring, you know, our experience here, you know, and is working with, you know, Rob's team at BAE. I've got to say, you know, our engineers who are, you know, very proud to work for Envision on our software, but actually, you know, the Navy Digital Services program, you know, Project Nelson and so on, has been really quite an eye-opener for us in terms of that rainbow team with a number of industry partners. I think has been a really successful model where, you know, it has worked, and where, you know, we've sent a number of engineers in, they've come back out, and it's enhanced them as engineers, as well as given us insight working closely with a partner. And I've got to say, it's probably one of the best models I've seen out there, because so often as an SME, you know, where we've worked with primes, you know, here's a subcontract, here's the set of requirements. We don't get the engagement with the front end users. So having this rainbow team has been wonderful. I think to go back to Phil's point about, you know, the global tech companies, I think there's an element there, Phil, where you've got global tech companies that are competing against traditional defense companies. I mean, yes, you know, the MOD has always benefited from exploiting large R&D and IP companies of large corporates. And I've been part of them. I think the global tech companies coming into the defense space is interesting. I think it's welcome because, you know, from a geospatial perspective, we look to give geospatial solutions. If Google Maps is your best option, use Google Maps rather than complicating it with an incredibly complicated geospatial solution. So I welcome it, even if it's an alternative to our specific defense solution.
Just to add to the cultural question, I think everybody's avoiding the resource question, but just to add to the sort of cultural aspects, I think everybody's, I think, fundamentally saying that yes, there needs to be some sort of career path within the armed forces that allows people to essentially become innovators. Run startups. Have a kind of VC mentality. I think from a cultural perspective as well. You take the model from universities now, or even big tech companies, where they spin out companies that address a particularly niche area, very specific, very key bit of technology that addresses a very key element of maybe a critical application or a system, and they give them full respect and legal entity. Essentially, they give them ability to be themselves from the marketing perspective, all the way from down to recruiting, and having a separate profit and loss line as well. So they become accountable, but also have the flexibility to be themselves. Can you do that within defense? And I think data being something which allows innovation to take place, it's the enabler for innovation. You need to give people the ability to come up with good ideas, have the backing from senior commanders or within a similar establishment within defense that takes those ideas, and as a VC, prioritizes which ones goes for investments. And that could be a business model for defense. I don't know. And then defense, being able to bring in external partners to help them facilitate the idea. It's kind of a similar model. And you draw the ideas from across the pond. I mean, the DoD are doing this. They've got their own innovation center based in Austin, in Texas. They bring in all the people. The frontline commanders are there giving companies problems to solve, and they're iterated and they become business lines. And that fundamentally helps the economic activity of the country. Or from a UK perspective, it will the technology economic drive line for becoming more intellectual property driven. It helps that model as well. So I just want to maybe bring sort of different mindset to how you can drive businesses from the data itself as well.
It's really cool. We are almost at the end. I'm conscious some of the guys have got to get away, so I'm sure it would be worth us doing a part 2 to this, because it's one of the questions which I think James asked around sort of the ethics of adversaries and how that would lead to war. I think we could go on to that for a long while. But so if we could just finish off with one quick question from you, and who says, what are the problems that will face the application of data, particularly at a tactical level? For example, how can data be used to inform decisions of individual soldiers, sailors, and airmen?
I think I'll give a one-word answer. Sorry, trust from me. There we go. Over.
Oh, that was far more philosophical than my one was going to be. Thanks for that, Rob. I'll give a slightly longer one. I think it will all be to do with balancing the ability to process at the edge with at the enterprise across degraded bandwidth limited environments, and having a system that allows you to move seamlessly between the two, whether you've got episodic bandwidth or whether you've got degraded and manipulated bandwidth. So I think it'll be trust will be one part, definitely, Rob, but the other part, the sort of the machinery that enables trust, will be the ability to match processing between the edge and the enterprise.
I think we can match Rob's answer on trust, because that's what it comes down to. Frankly, soldiers and don't need to know about the data. I think one of the issues will be having that interoperability of data, turning that into information and insights, and then the predictivity, so that they can come back to what's going on. If you've got a predictive element of that they trust, that's what they need. So there is a value pipeline.
I would just add to the element of information presentation. So each of those individuals, soldier, sailor, airman, will always have different requirements for how they utilize that information. So, how you effectively present information to them in order to create trust and assurity of what they're receiving is correct will help, but also with the decision making for them. So
I'd add my point, and I think that it's about adding value to them. I think at the end of the day, they are the people on the front line who are putting themselves in harm's way, and everything that we do that is not, the pointy edge of the spear is about making their life and their job more achievable. And so a lot of it's going to be about informing those people at the pointy edge of the spear, whether that's soldiers, sailors, or airmen, as to the value that this kind of work, the data integration, and the artificial intelligence data scientists can bring to them in terms of enabling them to do their job, and then having that understanding too of how to use it effectively.
Amazing. Well, that takes us to 11:30, everyone. So I know some people have got places to be, but that was a fascinating discussion, and I think we'll definitely do Regaining the Initiative, Exploiting Data Within Defence Part 2, because I think there was so much we still didn't cover. We'll make the recording available to everyone. We'll put it on the group so you can follow up, and we'll share people's LinkedIn profiles if there's further questions they want to ask, or to find out a little bit more about any of the panelist businesses. But thank you very much for joining, everyone. It was a fantastic discussion, and I hope to see you all soon.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.